Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ecological drought with a focus today on impacts on coastal ecosystems. This webinar is co-organized and co-hosted by NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, and the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, the National CASC. My name is Meredith Muth. I am a regional coordinator for the Southeast Drought Early Warning System. And joining me and welcoming you today is Sean Carter, the senior scientist at the National CASC. Sean and I will provide you with information on NIDIS, the CASC, this webinar series, and background on our speakers. And then our three speakers will share with us research and practice related to the relationship of drought and coastal ecosystems. After the presentation, we will open the webinar for your questions. The question and answer period will be facilitated by Elizabeth Waite, my colleague at NIDIS. And also, you may not hear Madeline Rubenstein in the background. She's with the National CASC, and she's working hard in the back to support the webinar and the Q&A. Throughout this webinar, all participants are muted. So if you have a question for a speaker, please write your question in the question box in the GoToMeeting control panel. At the close of the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we ask you to take a moment, please, and answer a few brief questions to provide us with feedback on this webinar series. Now, today's webinar is the last in a four-part series that focused on ecological drought, and we know that many of you have attended the entire series. This series was organized to raise awareness of ecological drought, share recent research and effective practices, and identify future avenues for research and collaboration. This series was jointly organized by NIDIS, the National CASC, and our speakers are contributing their expertise to meet these webinar goals. The first three webinars, in case you missed them, were on an introduction to ecological drought, planning for resilience, and drought, wildfire, and recovery. These have been extremely well attended with over 1,000 people registered for each webinar and some excellent speakers. So if you missed them, we encourage you to look at the webinar recordings. They are available on NIDIS's YouTube channel, and you can download the handout in the GoToWebinar control panel for links to these recordings. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and a link for the recording will be shared with you after the webinar by email. A brief background about NIDIS. NIDIS was created by congressional law in 2006 with a mandate to help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS achieves these goals through the development of regional drought early warning systems, shown on the map here, and through support to improve drought predictions and forecasting, effective drought planning and preparedness, and assessing the impacts of drought. All of our work is done in close collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. I also encourage attendees of this webinar to explore the new US Drought portal at www.drought.gov, where NIDIS hosts a wealth of drought information from many different sources. And now I will ask Sean Carter to share information on the CASC and the CASC's excellent work on ecological drought. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Meredith, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. As Meredith said, I'm Sean Carter. I'm the Chief Scientist for our National Climate Adaptation Science Center, based at the US Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia. My team and I there oversee climate impacts research and synthesis at a national center that coordinates with 8 regional centers and university consortia throughout the US. And our goal is synthesis efforts focused on the ecological consequences of drought when considering climate change. That was a recent synthesis. Today, it's my privilege to introduce 3 speakers that are helping managers plan for and adapt to the consequences of ecological drought. Our first speaker, I think, is Kristen Lackstrom, and she's a co-principal investigator with the Carolinas Integrated Sciences and Assessment, or CISA, a NOAA-RISA team working in the North Carolina and South Carolina. From 2012 to 2020, Kristen has organized a variety of projects and activities for the Coastal Carolinas Drought Early Warning System, the key focus of which was to improve the understanding and monitoring of drought's effects on coastal environmental resources. Beth Middleton is a research ecologist with the USGS Wetlands and Aquatic Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana. Her research is on the remediation of drought impacts on freshwater tidal wetlands of the Gulf and Atlantic coasts of the United States. and she's particularly interested in solving conservation problems using whole river perspectives. She's a fellow of the National Conservation Leadership Institute and past president of the Society of Wetland Scientists. And Dr. Mike Oslin is a research ecologist at the USGS Wetland Aquatic Research Center. In broad terms, his research examines the effects of global change on ecosystems and the implications for ecological conservation and restoration. Much of his research focuses on coastal wetland ecosystems. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker today, which I believe is Dr. Lackstrom.
Hey, Kristen, I just gave you controls.
Okay, can you see my first slide, the intro slide?
Yes, it's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. My goal for this presentation, oops, here we go. I'm going to forward. Sorry about that. My goal for this presentation is to set the stage for thinking about drought and coastal ecosystems. I'll be drawing from experiences working with stakeholders in North and South Carolina as part of the NIDIS Coastal Carolinas dues and show examples from our region's estuaries and coastal areas. And I use the term stakeholder to include the wide range of individuals who participated in the dues, including coastal resource and refuge managers, conservation groups, small business owners, researchers, and agencies operating at local, state, and federal levels. The Coastal Carolinas dues has now been integrated into a broader Southeast footprint where some of these activities will continue to evolve. So our engagement approach started from the bottom up to collect information about coastal drought impacts, information used to monitor and manage drought, and what additional tools, information, and resources were needed. And on a very basic level, a key challenge associated with drought and coastal ecosystems is knowing when an area is in drought. Iconic images of decimated crops and exposed stream beds are missing when you're in a humid subtropical climate and surrounded by water. But as we continue to learn, drought acts as a significant stressor by affecting the availability and timing of fresh water to support the ecological needs of coastal animals, plants, and habitats. In many of our coastal systems, impacts are connected to water quality conditions and through changes to the freshwater-saltwater interface. This interface is always in flux, and species and habitats in these environments are adapted to a certain amount of variability. However, extreme events such as drought can strain their capacity to cope. And during times of drought, lower river flows will bring higher than normal salinity levels to upstream areas. In terms of monitoring and management, an additional challenge stems from the differences between estuaries. Each estuary will exhibit different dynamics, vulnerabilities, and sensitivities, as suggested by the image in this slide. While both systems shown here will experience the same weather and climate, they're very different in terms of size, level of development, landscape characteristics, and other factors that will affect drought conditions and impacts. So as drought interacts with other stressors and processes, it can be difficult to isolate drought's contribution to adverse impacts and conditions. In the case of coastal ecosystems, the Ecological Drought Framework proposed by Crosby et al. Is a helpful tool to tease out the various dimensions of coastal drought vulnerability. In the next few slides, I'll walk through this framework showing examples from the Carolinas context and thinking about drought as the interacting factors that adversely affect freshwater availability and or contribute to increased salinity levels and fluctuations in that freshwater-saltwater interface. So exposure refers to the amount of water available to ecosystems during drought. On the left side, we have a whole host of weather and climate factors that may contribute to drought conditions. In addition to the rainfall or lack of rainfall occurring in the coastal zone, we must also consider the rainfall occurring upstream. Tropical storms and hurricanes are often referred to as drought busters, and single events may have a significant effect on drought, presence of drought or the absence of drought. Coastal areas are also being affected by sea level rise, a chronic stressor exposing coastal ecosystems to increasing salinity levels. Landscape characteristics influence interactions with the tides and winds. The map shows 3 different estuary types in the Carolinas. So these bar-built estuaries are protected somewhat from the influence of tides by barrier islands, and wind plays a more important part. Coastal plain estuaries include rivers located entirely within the coastal zone. So because of their flat topography, water moves very slowly through the river and into the estuary, and tides play a much larger role in these estuaries. Piedmont estuaries include the rivers that begin or flow through the Piedmont, an area further from the coast that's characterized by foothills and higher elevations. As with other estuaries of this type, as shown here in the Yadkin PD Basin. Flows are much larger than those in the coastal plain systems. So the other component of exposure relates to human actions. Coastal ecosystems are facing growing stressors in the form of population growth, urbanization, and increasing sprawl, and the Carolinas are no exception. Competing demands for and uses of water, whether for municipal water supply, agriculture, or industry, can limit water supplies for ecological use. Here, sensitivity refers to how and the extent to which an ecosystem or species is affected by drought. And adaptive capacity refers to the ability to cope with or adapt to drought conditions. In terms of ecological characteristics, many species have developed tolerances for different physical, chemical, and biological conditions, which may make them more or less vulnerable to changing salinities. The ability to move to desired conditions is obviously an advantage, and sessile species such as oysters are vulnerable to these extremes. Mobile species may be more adaptable, but may also face other pressures and stressors. So for example, blue crabs occupy both salt and freshwater habitats at different times in their life cycle, but research in South Carolina has shown their susceptibility to disease and predation depends on river flows and salinities and their ability to access the right combination of conditions at the right time. In terms of human management of resources, again, we must look both upstream and in the coastal regions themselves. Most of our Piedmont estuaries are affected by river modification and regulation, so major dams and reservoirs located upstream are used for energy generation, water supply, flood control, and recreation. And their operating rules and protocols determine how and when water is released. And in the coastal zone, we have a variety of human alterations to hydrology. We have impoundments used in managed wetland refuges and other drainage systems, canals, and diversions used for agriculture. So ecological responses to drought are likely to be habitat or species specific and be influenced by a variety of interacting drivers, as illustrated in the previous few slides. Now, in these next few slides, I'd just like to highlight a few examples of how drought impacts have manifested themselves in some of our most vulnerable systems. So tidal freshwater wetlands occupy the upper ends of estuaries and act as transition habitats between inland rivers and the coast. They usually receive sufficient freshwater flows to keep water salinities below 1 part per thousand, but are very vulnerable to shifts in salinity and flooding regimes. So even seemingly minor increases that we've had with recent droughts have affected plant productivity and growth. Salt marsh dieback has occurred in many locations in the US Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico coasts over the past 2 decades. Droughts has been considered one of the contributing factors, although other cumulative stressors and processes are also likely involved. And stress brought on by multiple extreme events such as drought and hurricanes and sea level rise is causing some marsh and forest habitats to reach tipping points and transition to new habitats and ecosystems with higher salinity tolerances, such as this picture of this ghost forest. Ecological responses and ecosystem service impacts are intertwined, and it can be very challenging to directly link drought to these impacts due to the many interacting processes involved. During the extreme drought conditions of 2002, municipal and industrial intakes in the Georgetown and Myrtle Beach area were closed due to salinity exposure and intrusion into the very upper reaches of these river systems. Our interviews with small business owners and fisheries and recreation sectors indicated that those dependent on marine-based resources and activities have not been very much affected by drought, as might be expected. However, those that use and depend on estuarine resources did report impacts to include reduced availability and quality of some commercial and recreational species and disruption to recreational activities. So collectively, what we see by going through this exercise is that droughts contribute to a wide range of direct and indirect impacts that propagate through our interconnected natural and human systems. And these can be very difficult to tease apart. Based on our work, I think this points to a need for researchers and practitioners alike to be clear on what we mean by impacts and which part of this impact chain we are researching, monitoring, or managing. While there's certainly more to learn about ecological responses to drought, the blue arrows point to 2 areas where we found that a lot more attention is warranted. First, we need to better understand the connections between drought-related impacts to ecosystems and these ecosystem services. It can be really challenging to collect socioeconomic impact data, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, and especially for businesses that may be affected by drought, but aren't really thinking about drought as one of their key stressors. And also better understanding of the connections between drought-related habitat changes or loss and the ecosystem benefits such as flood mitigation may encourage community leaders and planners to think more broadly about climate effects on these services. Now, second, we've heard a lot from resource managers and other stakeholders looking for guidance, information, and tools to help them incorporate drought information into long-term monitoring and restoration projects. Ecological information is plentiful and available for a lot of purposes, but it's typically not well integrated into drought management and planning decisions, and vice versa. Drought planning and management doesn't always consider ecological considerations. Research is frequently siloed by the various processes and effects illustrated here. So we need to recognize that coastal concerns are not only about drought. Drought interacts with a lot of other extreme events and climate change, and any sort of guidance needs to speak to the full continuum of climate hazards, and that type of information will be more useful for resource managers. So I just wanted to close here with a couple slides to illustrate one way that we try to tailor information for coastal drought decisions through the Coastal Carolinas DEWs. One way to do that is to focus on salinity. So as I've noted, a key stressor and cross-cutting issues for estuarine systems in both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So the Coastal Salinity Index was developed to address the priority identified by our DEW stakeholders for a tool to help them monitor and assess the effects of drought in coastal areas. Commonly used indices use many different inputs for classifying drought, and these are focused typically on precipitation, stream flow, evaporation, and soil moisture. However, these indices don't capture the dynamics associated with drought in coastal areas. So the CSI uses a similar approach to the standardized precipitation index to show the probability of recording a given amount of salinity for the calculated time interval. And the color ramp here shown on the left shows the different coastal salinity index values. So a value of normal indicates historical mean salinity, and the positive and negative values represent increasingly fresh and saline conditions. And the values are site specific. And one of our colleagues at USGS, who's been working on the CSI project, has been using the CSI to characterize salinity trends in combination with variability in freshwater inflows, with the goal of improving understanding of how short and long-term salinity trends influence the living resources within an estuary, and also with the objective of informing long-term monitoring and management of these resources. So while initially developed as a drought indicator, this example shows that the CSI tool can also be used to understand the broader hydroclimate context, examine the processes and drivers that contribute to salinity fluctuations, and identify tipping points and thresholds for affected species and systems. So as I noted, again, the Coastal Carolinas DEWs has been incorporated into the bigger Southeast DEWs, and so we hope that a lot of this work will continue through that effort as well. And my final slides just have some links to information about the DEWs and the Coastal Salinity Index and some other links to references. And that's it. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview. I am now going to pass this over to Beth Middleton.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. My part of the webinar is to talk about the freshwater end of the gradient, and I'm going to talk about from the salt to the tidal freshwater area. I'm going to talk about freshwater tidal forests and freshwater marshes. And so the effects of drought on the freshwater end of the gradient are really severe, and there are now forests especially that are developing along the coast that are really in a relic setting. The trees are not necessarily being replaced after these major droughts, and sometimes it's a matter of overwater extraction plus severe drought. And so what I'm going to talk about is a couple of case histories where, one, I talk about the trees and the vegetation dying because of drought, and then the other setting is to talk about freshwater remediation and how that can actually address the problems of drought and salinification in the freshwater areas. So there are various long-term research areas that I've been working on where I have had the vegetation in my sites begin to die, and even the peat elevation begin to fall. And so I'm going to talk a bit about this, but a relic situation is where you have trees no longer and vegetation no longer regenerating. So when the adult trees die, it reverts to something else. And that is definitely a severe conservation problem. And one of the places I want to talk about in detail is the Big Thicket National Park along the Neches River. And during the drought of 2011 and 12, a great deal of the cypress trees there began to die and to be very stressed. And the problem was the salinity levels had gone up to about 4 to 6 parts per thousand. And the published tipping point for bald cypress swamps to change to either open water or some other more saline coastal vegetation type is 2 parts per thousand over 50% of the time. And there's been a lot of subsequent conversation about what that level should actually be. And I think it's very important that we better understand the tipping point in particular, because it allows us to do some possible hydrologic remediation or remediation to try to counterbalance that. And I have some very interesting information about the effects of flooding and diversions, showing that in certain cases it can freshen the water and create a situation where the tree mortality stops, which is what happened in my long-term research sites along the Neches River. And the floods of 2016, and especially after Hurricane Harvey, which was the freshwater event, the highest event in the history of hurricanes, it lowered the salinity to less than 0.2 parts per thousand in my research sites. The trees began to grow, and the cone sizes and the cone numbers were much bigger after that event. Just to show you what that did to the hydrology of the area, all of the signals of hydrology during 2012, 11 and 12 drought were really indicating drought. The local precipitation was very down. This is a very data heavy slide, but I want to show you that the indicators of hydrology all show the same thing. The local river heights were down, the local groundwater was down in 2012. And I think what's really interesting is that if you look at the terrestrial water equivalent thickness from the great satellites, it was also decidedly down during 2011 and 12. So the response of the vegetation then in the hardest hit parts of that drought, for example, Texas, was for some of the trees to die. So I have extensive information about how the trees responded both to that drought and subsequent flooding. And part of it is with dendrometer bands looking at tree growth. And Neches River is down here. This is my long-term, these are my long-term research sites in the southeastern part of the US. And very interestingly, looking at the dendrometer bands, which measure the growth of the trees, in 2011 and 12, when the growing season precipitation was very low, the tree growth was low. And in 2011 and 12, when the precipitation was low, the salinity became high, and the tree growth was high. So there's really a very clear relationship to drought. When reflooding occurred in, say, in 2016 and 17, the trees grew much better. So in years when you have precipitation, the trees grew well. Also, looking at the formation of seeds, and in this case, this has to do with relic forest formation and whether or not the forest can give enough sufficient nutrition to the seeds to actually regrow seedlings and saplings. In the drought, the cones were very small, and then during the flooding of 2016 and 17, the cones were kind of medium sized, but interestingly, the year after 2017, the cones really developed and became much larger than they had been before. And one must keep in mind that cones take a full year to develop, so they take a while to actually show what's going on with the hydrology. So that's the bad news on drought. The better news on remediation is that in situations where you can freshen the water. So, for example, when the hydrologic remediation was done during the Gulf oil spill, there was 4 months of very large amounts of water in the Barataria Basin, and the trees responded by growing by 5 times or by 3 times the normal amount for 5 years. There's another situation in Australia during the Millennium Drought where the Australians released 2 months of fresh water. This was specifically to revive the trees that were dying in the drought, and they became healthy for more than a year. So this is very interesting research and indicates that short-term water releases can revive vegetation, but the tricky part of it is, what is the exact tipping point? When does this need to be done in order to revive the trees? So the Gulf oil spill was, I think, of an accidental experiment for me, and my trees in my long-term research site received much more water and much less salinity during that period of time. This is a detailed, very data-heavy slide that I put in so that you might be interested in looking at the ecohydrology paper that goes into this comparison in detail. But I think simply you can think of this as a 4-month freshwater flush of water that really helped the trees grow. And the specific data that I have that show this is that in my long-term research sites, after the hydrologic remediation, the trees grew much more, the litter production was more, the root production was less for a little while. If anybody's interested in why that happened, I can explain it to you. But more interestingly, the root production was much higher right after that. And that, I think, was related to differences in peat building, because before the hydrologic remediation in these same sites, the elevation was going down, and then after the hydrologic remediation, the peat elevation went up for a number of years. And so I think this really tells you something about the water management in the coast. Where we can share fresh water, we need to. I have another example in Maryland where the peat is collapsing after groundwater salinification. Another story. But I think that the very important message here is that trees can be revived after drought and after salinification if the water is applied in time, and it allows them to have better production, better crown growth, and better regeneration. So these are key bits of research, and we definitely need more information about how to revive freshwater tidal vegetation after droughts and over water extraction. There's some other studies that show that actually applying water, even in brackish and salt marsh, actually help revive the vegetation. And I think that is one of the main ways that we need to go with some of the research. Now, I really think that in terms of water management, the technical solutions are fairly easy. I think, we know freshwater is something that is really good for freshwater vegetation. The problem is that everyone wants fresh water, and the social solutions to the problem are very contentious. I talked to some of the Australians about what they did along the Murray River to actually come to a water decision about how to share this water for the eucalyptus trees. And in fact, what they did, they involved all of the people that were involved, and they felt that if they hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been able to come to a binding decision about what to do. And so what I think we need to do to actually address this conservation problem to avoid relic ecosystems and dying vegetation on the coast is, of course, to understand the ecological tipping points better and how to apply the water. And in particular, we need strategies to avoid this relic forest formation, and also how to avoid having the trees die in the first place. And the Australians pointed out to me that it was kind of like a dying cow. And if you give the water to the cow soon enough, it will live. But if you give the water to the cow too late, it will die anyway. So the trick is to know when and how much fresh water needs to be diverted or somehow shared with those conservation areas. And I think that we need to come to an understanding of the socioeconomic balance of the needs of conservation and humans, and that will indeed be the most difficult part of the situation. I can hear the thunder rolling into Lafayette right now. So I want to hope that Mike Osland, who is the next speaker, is going to make it through his presentation, but that's what I have for now. So thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Beth. And now we're going to move a little bit farther to the coast. Mike Osland, yes, they're under severe weather warnings right now, but hopefully we'll make through it. Thank you, Mike. All yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to be talking about the more saline side of the estuary and speaking about coastal wetlands. And so coastal wetlands are highly vulnerable to climate change. They're located at the land-sea interface. And so I frequently hear two general questions related to coastal wetlands. The first is, how will sea level rise, ecological drought, and other aspects of climate change affect coastal wetland ecosystems? And then second, how can we improve efforts to make sure that these ecosystem goods and services are available for future generations? So coastal wetlands provide many different ecosystem services. They're highly valuable ecosystems. They protect coastlines, they store carbon, they provide fish and wildlife habitat, they improve water quality, they support coastal food webs, they provide seafood, and they provide recreational opportunities. And these photos show some examples of those ecosystem services. Okay. So that said, coastal wetlands in the US are diverse. We have a lot of different kinds of coastal wetlands in the US, and that diversity is strongly influenced by climate. So where it's hot and dry, we tend to get hypersaline conditions as those oceanic salts evaporate and become concentrated. And so coastal wetlands in arid and semi-arid regions will be dominated by algal mats, as shown in A, or succulent plants, as shown in B. Now, where it's wetter and less salty, coastal wetlands will be dominated by the graminoid or grass-like marshes that we're very familiar with, or mangrove forests. And so I always like to take the audience on a photo tour of these ecosystems so they can see what I'm talking about before I jump into data. So we're going to begin in Grand Bay, Mississippi. This is the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and here is a photo of a salt marsh. Salt marshes are among the most common types of coastal wetlands in the US. They're dominant along the northern Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic coast of the United States, and also the Pacific Northwest. If you move to Florida, mangrove forests are the common coastal wetland in South and Central Florida, and they're especially abundant in Everglades National Park. And here's a photo of a mangrove forest. Now on the dry and salty end of that continuum, I'm going to show a photo from the Laguna Madre system, which is a very dry and salty environment. It receives less rainfall, the oceanic salts evaporate and become concentrated, and because of that, it's a place that's very difficult for most plants and animals to survive. And so in those climatic settings, coastal wetlands are dominated by succulent plants, as shown beyond these mangroves in the foreground. And then in the back of the photo, there's this area without plants. That's a salt flat, or an area that's covered in an algal mat. primarily due to hypersaline conditions. So that's a quick photo tour of the different kinds of wetlands. So this information was covered in a recent paper that focuses on the climatic controls of foundation plant species in coastal wetlands across the conterminous United States. And it was the work of a group of USGS scientists on all three coasts, so the Pacific coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and also the Atlantic coast. And we wanted to synthesize the different kinds of information regarding the different kinds of coastal wetlands across the US. And so we divided the country into 12 biogeographic regions, which is shown in panel A. And then within each of those regions, we identified the dominant foundation plant species and grouped them according to these 4 groups, which are shown in B. So yellow is succulent plant. Succulent plants are common in California and also in South Texas. The blue is the grass-like systems, the marshes, and those are dominant in the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic coast. And then the red is mangrove, and those are dominant in South and Central Florida. And then in South Texas, you have those unvegetated systems, which are shown by the black. And there's really loud thunder here, so I'm just going to keep going. But if I go out, it's because of the thunder. So our next step was to take that information and relate it to different climatic factors. And here's an illustration of that. And so on the x-axis, we have air temperature, and I'm going to ignore that. But in a real simple way, that air temperature controls whether a system's dominated by mangrove or marsh. And then what's really interesting within the context of drought is the y-axis, because this is global aridity. So we have 4 different aridity indices, from very, very dry and salty on the bottom to very, very wet and less salty at the top. And the colors represent the different plant dominance. So red is mangrove, yellow is succulent, blue is graminoid. And from top to bottom, you get a transition from graminoid to succulent to unvegetated. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But climate plays a very important role, and aridity and salinity play a very important role in determining the types of coastal wetlands that we have. Okay, so as part of that study, we identified 24 different foundation plant species across the country. It included 14 grass-like plants, graminoids, 3 mangroves, and 7 succulents. And we quantified the amount of research that's been directed at each of those 24 species and found that 45% of the research has been directed at spartina alterniflora and 22% is directed at 2 mangroves. So there's very little research done on many of these species. The next step was to evaluate the amount of sea level rise, warming, or drought-focused research on these species. And, oh, hey Beth, could you mute? Or maybe someone can mute Beth. And so what we found is that there's been very little work focused on drought. If you look at the y-axis on the bottom, there's up to 40 papers. That the y-axis is 40, and most of those papers have been focused on 3 species. So there's been very little work focused on coastal wetland plants related to drought. And so the take-home message from that paper is that there's a pressing need for additional species and functional group-specific research that can be used to better anticipate coastal wetland responses to sea level rise and climate change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about drought. And so here's a definition of drought that was used in a recent paper, Crosby et al., 2017. It's an episodic deficit in water availability that drives ecosystems beyond thresholds of vulnerability, impacts ecosystem services, and triggers feedbacks in natural and or human systems. Now in coastal systems, including coastal wetlands, that deficit in water availability is really controlled by salinity. And this was shown in the previous 2 presentations as well. So salinity makes it challenging for plants and animals to acquire fresh water. So that key term that's in red, deficit in water availability, is really controlled by salinity. Where it's low, there's a low water deficit, and where salinity is a high, for example, around 100 ppt, it's very, very hard for plants and animals to obtain the fresh water they need to support their physiology. And so, as you can expect, freshwater inputs and salinity govern the abundance of ecosystems. And here are some nice figures from these reports from Texas. regarding the influence of freshwater replacement time. These are inflows and salinities on the abundance of marsh, swamp, tidal flats, seagrass, and oysters. And then if you go further back in Texas, there's a good history of this kind of work in Texas. This is from a paper in 1966, Copeland, which related the fishery production to freshwater inflows in different Texas estuaries. So freshwater inputs and salinity govern the abundance of ecosystems, the abundance of species, and that's really evident in arid climates like Texas and also California. So a big part of my research is focused on identifying climatic thresholds that separate ecosystems. And so here's an illustration of that. The area in red is that tipping point or threshold. And so the goal in these kinds of efforts is to identify the threshold that separates those two stable states. And another way of thinking about that is with these ball and cup diagrams. So if you're near the threshold, the ball is at that peak, and a small change in climate can push that ball into the valley, into a different stable state. And once it's there in the valley, it's much harder to push that ball up on and over the peak into the other valley. So now, within the context of drought and rainfall for coastal wetlands, some of our work has been focused on transitions in Texas, which produced this change in functional groups and ecosystem properties from marsh to succulent plant to algal mat. And here's an illustration of that precipitation gradient. So it's very, very dry near the Mexico border with rainfall between 600 to 800 millimeters per year. And then near the Louisiana border, it's much wetter, 1,400 to 1,800 millimeters per year. And across that gradient, you have a decrease. As it gets drier, you have a decrease in plant coverage. So the y-axis here is the percentage of tidal wetlands covered by foundation plant species. And right around 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, you begin to see that decline. So that's the start of that threshold zone. And so beyond that, the coverage of wetland plants decreases. And this has a big effect on ecosystem goods and services, because many of the wetland ecosystem goods and services are tightly linked to foundation plant species. So the take-home message from that work is that there's a zone of instability in the Gulf of Mexico that's highly sensitive to small changes in freshwater availability and drought. And I would suspect that the ecosystems in California are very, very similar because they have similar plant composition. And that's not to say that all these other areas aren't vulnerable to drought. They are as well. It's just that the effects are different. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So one of the most extreme effects of drought, and this was talked about in the previous two presentations, is that drought can lead to mass mortality of plants. It can lead to sudden vegetation dieback. And on the bottom of this slide, I've highlighted two reviews on this topic. So one is for Marshes, Albert et al. 2008, and then for Mangroves, Sipla et al. 2018, both in the same journal, Estuarine, Coastal, and Shelf Science. They're both good reviews on these mortality events. And this photo is of a brown marsh event that occurred in Louisiana. And here's another photo. This is a photo of a mangrove dieback event. You can see the dead trees in the foreground. So here is a slide that shows the mechanisms and outcomes in a really simple way regarding the mechanisms and outcomes of drought-induced dieback. So decreases in precipitation, decreases in surface freshwater delivery, and/or increases in temperature can lead to higher salinity, and we could be talking about hypersaline conditions here, or we could be talking about a 1 ppt increase. It really depends on the ecosystem. And that produces a physiological stress due to the water deficit. Again, that increase in salinity makes it harder for plants and animals to acquire fresh water. And most often that physiological stress, there's an interaction with other factors, biotic or abiotic. From a biotic perspective, it could include snails, crabs, fungus, other factors that affect the plant and contribute to the dieback beyond just the salinity. So those factors collectively will lead to the sudden vegetation dieback, this mass mortality. And in terms of outcomes, there are three potential outcomes on the bottom. The first is a post-dieback vegetation recovery, and this is probably the most common case, that the vegetation recovers in a couple years. The other two are more extreme. The middle one is an ecosystem transformation, where because of the drought, the ecosystem is transformed to a totally different ecosystem. And then the third is the most extreme case, but does occur. It's where the drought and the increase in salinity can actually lead to peak collapse, which decreases the elevation of the wetland and allows the conversion of the wetland to open water, which is wetland loss. So the take-home message for my talk is that, as you can expect, drought has a strong effect on coastal wetlands. It's mediated by primarily by salinity. It controls this diversity of wetlands that we have in the United States. Drought is one of the primary factors that controls the kind of wetland that we have in a given area. And then more locally, land management and climate can lead to salinity increases, which can lead to vegetation dieback. And so we were asked to end with a slide on research needs. And so from the first paper, I want to highlight the research need regarding the species and functional group specific research that can be used to better anticipate coastal wetland responses to drought. And then lastly, drought in wetlands is often observed by coastal managers, but not well documented or investigated by scientists. And so there's a need for field and satellite-based investigations of drought-induced vegetation dieback events. Specifically to address the three questions in this slide. Well, after a dieback event, what's the time to recovery? Does the system recover? Is there an ecological regime shift? If so, what triggers that and what does it look like? And then lastly, for the most extreme cases, under what conditions is the peat underlying those coastal wetlands expected to collapse and lead to wetland loss? And so thanks so much for the invitation to present, and thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirsten, Beth, and Michael. Your presentations were excellent. I learned a lot, so thank you very much. We have quite a few questions, and if folks have other questions, if attendees have more questions, please write them in the question box of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to take what we can in the remaining 11 minutes of this webinar and perhaps be able to answer a few after the webinar. So why don't I just jump right in? For Dr. Lackstrom and all the other speakers, if you'd like to speak to this, there's a question about hydrologic systems. As hydrologic systems change in response to climate change, how should we think about system profile change? While cycles of droughts and floods might be natural, we are now dealing with a dynamic, non-stationary system. How does recognizing this changing baseline affect how we think about drought moving forward? Why don't we start with Dr. Lackstrom, and then if Dr. Oslin and Dr. Middleton would like to answer it, you're welcome to hop in too. Thank you.
Hi, this is Kirsten. Yeah, there's, obviously a lot to think about there because the changing climate system, right? It may be changing, more so the extremes is where we're going to be seeing the effects in the coastal ecosystems, right? So, the extent to which there may be more extreme precip events or more frequent, more intense floods, or likewise, even more frequent droughts, right? So that changing variability, I think, is what's going to be kind of the issue to think about in conjunction with factors like sea level rise, right? So it's really these interacting factors that are really important to consider. I think we have ways to go in a lot of places to really think about how to incorporate that type of information into, kind of on the management and monitoring side. Again, a lot of these things are kind of done in silos. And so to the extent that we can kind of promote and try to participate in processes where we're integrating some of this information, would be very helpful.
Sorry, Elizabeth Wade, are you still there?
I apologize, I muted myself. Yes, I'm sorry, I was speaking. Dr. Middleton, Dr. Oslin, would you like to add anything to that response, or otherwise I'll move on to the next question.
This is Beth Middleton. There is something I'd like to say about that. There's actually a lot going on in that question, and one aspect of it that I'd like to point out is that while there are a lot of changes going on in terms of I guess our expectations of sea level rise and temperatures affecting the coast, I think some of the impacts that we're seeing are really from water overusage. And so I think the idea that, and one of the things I got from that question was the idea that change is inevitable. And while it may be inevitable, I think that it's not necessarily something where we should just say, well, there's nothing we can do. We can't hydrologically remediate because these trees are all going to die. And that might not be what all of that the speaker was getting at, but I think that there is a lot more to be done from a conservation perspective if we think about how we might be able to conserve and protect some of these areas on the coast.
All right, thank you. For all of the presenters, how do these dynamics of drought in coastal ecosystems play out in Hawaii and Alaska? Are the patterns of drought similar in the coastal areas in these locations? So that was to anybody who might like to speak to it.
Crickets. I would just say that my expertise lies outside of Hawaii and Alaska, so I will really defer comments to anyone else who might have them. Sorry, this is just not a place I've
Fair
worked.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Mike. I'm also not an expert in Hawaii or Alaska, but I'd love to go investigate these questions there. But no,
Oh yeah,
more seriously, I mean, Alaska is very different, just in terms of the climate, and so I really feel uncomfortable addressing the questions of drought there. But a lot of the questions in Hawaii would be very similar.
Okay, thank you. And also for all of the speakers, has the research on drought in coastal ecosystems included research on soils? To what extent do different soil profiles affect how ecosystems experience drought?
Ooh, that's a good question. I like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Beth.
Well, I just wanted to say in my research, it does make a difference, certainly. And in some of the studies that I've done, for example, on organic matter levels in the soils, it was important to look at soil types and to look at differences. And across the coast, you go from, shallow limestone underlain wetlands at least in the northern part of Florida, over to much deeper peats to the west, and so it actually does make a huge difference. And but I think it's one of those things where the details of how you might go about doing management planning in those areas very much depend on what the details of that are, but the generalities are probably the same for all of them.
Thank you.
This is Kirsten. I would just add, we didn't have enough time to talk about this in the context of this presentation, but as part of the Coastal Carolinas dues, one of the other concerns stakeholders had was the management and monitoring of organic soils, because they also have, kind of unique sensitivities and vulnerabilities to drought conditions. And so when those peat soils, organic peat soils, dry out, can create really intense, long-lasting fires that are difficult to manage and control. So we have a lot of examples in different refuges from North Carolina, actually from Virginia down to Florida, where these peat soils are prevalent and where there's increased concerns about wildfire risks. So one of our projects was to integrate some new monitoring systems for some of those soil types in North Carolina. So that's something that was led by the North Carolina State Climate Office. So if anybody's interested in that, they can go to the DEW's website, and I think there's some links to some of those projects there.
Thanks, Kristen. So the links to the NIDIS website are in the handouts. You can download from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can see a link to NIDIS, or just go directly to drought.gov. Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, if I can read it really quickly. For Dr. Oslin, as well as the other speakers, are you able to utilize satellite imagery and remote sensing products to assist your research on the regional to national landscape level?
Yeah, definitely. So for coastal wetlands, in terms of the effects of drought, one of the clearest signals for vegetation dieback would be the change in greenness. And so that's a really simple example of the value of remote sense products. Yeah, and there's a strong need for that. There's not very much research focused on that, but it would be very valuable to have that kind of information.
Yes, and this is Beth Middleton. I've started to take a look at the GRACE satellite imagery to figure out like what the regional signals are in drought, and there's often a strong relationship with strong droughts and vegetation mortality. So I'm finding that to really give a lot of information to the work that I'm doing.
Great, thank you. Everyone on the webinar, our panelists have kindly agreed to stay for a few more minutes to address your questions. So we will take a couple more here. So thank you, folks, for staying with us. For Dr. Oslin, you showed a map depicting coastal ecosystems in Texas being highly sensitive to changes in freshwater influx. Do you have any thoughts on why such sensitivity is not seen for other coastal areas in the Gulf of Mexico?
So yeah, and by showing that slide, I didn't mean to imply that other coastal systems across the country aren't sensitive. They are. Any increase in salinity is going to trigger ecological change in all coastal systems. But Texas is especially, especially sensitive because it's right at the verge, it's right at the transition points, the thresholds between different kinds of ecosystems. And if you drive across the coast of Texas and visit different wetlands along the way, you'll see obvious transitions from grass-dominated marshes near the Louisiana border to succulent-dominated marshes in central Texas, and then these really, really dry wetlands in South Texas. And so that sensitivity in that slide is really more of, has to do with drought and salinity triggered changes in wetland composition. But I don't mean to imply that other coastal wetlands aren't sensitive to changes in salinity, because they are. It's just a different kind of effect.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. Question for everyone, especially Dr. Lackstrom. What are the effects of coastal drought on migratory fish species?
Sorry, I was unmuting myself. I mean, first, I'm not an expert, a fisheries expert, so I don't want to, claim that I know exactly how all these interactions would take place. What we've seen from our research and engagements in the Carolinas, specifically related to the DEWs, is that, a lot of the resource managers, are more concerned about the species like the blue crabs and that are going to, migrate from different freshwater to saltwater locations depending on where they are in the life cycle. Also, when we've talked to resource managers, like in the Department of Natural Resources, they've raised questions about how drought might affect nursery habitat for species like red drum. So if their juveniles are, kind of hanging out in the estuaries, right? Will they be affected? So it's still really an open question, at least for our region and our area and the work that I've done. But again, not a fisheries specialist, so don't want to talk more beyond that, what our experiences were in the context of the dues.
Thank you. Beth, Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Okay, we have a few more questions here. Has drought had an effect on the northern migration of mangroves in the Gulf and along the east coast of Florida?
Ooh, I'll take that one.
Thank you.
So yeah, so since 1989, which is the last major freeze event, well, I should say I should qualify that because the recent event in Texas has affected mangroves in Texas as well. But except for in Texas, mangroves have been migrating north since the last major freeze event in 1989. And in Florida and Louisiana, that mangrove migration is different than in Texas. So in Texas, that aridity gradient affects the ability of mangroves to migrate because there's certain coastal wetlands that are too salty for mangroves. And so like a good example would be the Laguna Madre system. If it was a fresher system, mangroves would be more abundant than they are. And so in general, across the Gulf and in Florida, mangroves have been moving northward, and that's been driven by warming winters, so a reduction in extreme freeze events. And we just had a USGS press release on that topic today that came out, and also a paper in Global Change Biology that's focused on the tropicalization of systems near this tropical temperate transition. But that tropicalization in Texas is also strongly influenced by aridity and salinity. So there's kind of a long answer to that question.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Dr. Middleton, to what extent can the findings from your coastal work be applied to freshwater bodies such as the Great Lakes?
I think they can't be applied directly because of the compounding influences of salinity on the coast. I think the effects of drought on freshwater species are really severe on the coast. However, the generalities of it are the same in that whenever plants get to the point where they reach that incipient mortality risk, or the point of no return in terms of a drought, they will die. And so I think the freshwater Great Lakes systems have much the same possibilities of having aquatic ecosystems die as the coastal settings. It's just I think the coastal tidal wetlands are very, very stressed by drought.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you. And while you're on, Dr. Middleton, perhaps you could speak to what role does seasonality play in the timing of reviving dying forests with the provision of water?
This is one of those areas where we probably don't have enough information exactly. I mean, we have, some haphazard information about water being released and salinity going down and plants growing more. And so that does inform us that, for example, in my studies where fresh water was released during a growing season, that benefited the plants greatly. I would guess, and this is a guess because I don't have study information on this, but if you had an influx of fresh water during a dormant season, say in the winter, that could push the needle downward on salinity and actually improve the growth later on by just changing the salinity levels in the soil, or even in the groundwater interchange. So it's one of those areas where we really need more information, because it's critical to know when and how much water to release in order to actually revive plants, and we simply don't know that. But the good news, from my research, is that by releasing water, you can actually improve the growth of the plants. So we now know that.
Thank you. And I think that's going to wrap it up for the questions. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn over to Meredith Muth.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Once again, a huge thank you to our 3 excellent presenters. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us. Again, reminder to please take that survey if you can when it pops up. One of the questions is, what do you think are some of the research needs in this growing field of ecological drought? So please feel free to include your suggestions there. And again, on behalf of NIDIS, the National CASC program, thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to join us, and we wish you a wonderful day.